Welcome to the latest edition of the All In Skills podcast. And today I'm, for the first time, being joined by somebody from New York. Scott Piro, hello. How are you?
Hey, I'm terrific today. Thanks, Colin. How are you?
I'm very well. Is it warm over there? I'm hearing about a heat wave.
It is. It's getting hot again. Yes.
Of course, I'm not sure that you're into the football so much, but we've been following American weather for the last month or so.
Well, no, I haven't been personally watching a lot of the matches, but I'm glad everyone else is enjoying it. And it's nice to see so many people enjoying New York and other cities in the U.S.
Yeah, you got the final, right? The final's in New York.
I don't know.
Scott, can you tell me what is it that you do?
I am a communications professional. I've worked in public relations. I've worked as a communications director for a pair of nonprofits. And I've worked in internal communications. And what I do is I help executives or institutions build trust with their stakeholders during periods of change. And I've done this for technology companies as well as nonprofits and, using storytelling to help leaders to support leaders. And these days I'm also doing a little bit of individual content creation for several different platforms.
You talked about, and it's interesting, I'm going to ask this question again. You mentioned something, working with companies during periods of change. Can you explain what that means, periods of change?
Yes, well, I was working for a technology company, global, and they were doing something called the Digital Transformation Initiative, essentially making sure every organization within their business had standardized access to the same numbers. Previously, they didn't have that system and people were exporting things and supply chain was looking at one set of numbers versus sales and product. Everybody was looking at different numbers. And the project predated me, but I was around for the test date, which was actually near you in New Zealand, and then the go live date. And there was a lot of messaging that had to happen, both to the company at large, as well as more siloed messaging that needed to go just to each of the organizations. So leaders in the customer teams talking to their teams, and on the product side talking to their teams, and so forth. And it was just a lot of, what I learned was that it's not really that people fear change. It's that they need to know what's changing and how it's changing and why it's changing. And if you give them a narrative and an explanation, it's kind of like, I don't know if it's popular where you are, but UD40 is like a type of lubricant or grease that you can just use for everything. It acts as a lubricant and it builds trust. And I'm happy to say that that go live date was successful. And although I'm no longer at that company, they are all using the same sets of numbers, and I'm sure it's made the business much more smooth and standardized from one end to the other.
You've touched on building a narrative and storytelling. Can I take it that you studied like English literature or something like that?
My degree is in film and television production. It did not really work in that industry. I used the video production skills I learned, and I was hired by a public relations agency. And I was a media trainer, and I would set up, besides setting up lights, camera, and sound and everything, and helping executives rehearse for appearances on CNN or whatever broadcast networks they were going on, I also would make sure that I capture the footage and edit it together, the top of the show with their segment, and make copies for everyone. And there was some downtime in that role, and eventually I got recruited by some of the public relations executives to do campaigns. And it's all storytelling, and there's not a lot of time for slow exposition. It's you've got to have a hook in your email or telephone pitch right away to get a reporter's attention. And so storytelling, big part of public relations. And later in my career, moving into still external facing, but no longer generating media coverage, but dealing with creating the content on a company's website, creating the content in their social channels, creating content for their email channels and other marketing channels. It's all storytelling.
How important is it to believe in the product or the mission of the thing that you're you're promoting?
It's very helpful. When I was in books and authors doing public relations, I couldn't read every book I worked on, but I tried to read the press materials that supported it and have conversations with the authors. When I started doing PR for technology startups, same thing. Having conversations with the founders is very helpful. And when you're doing PR, which is it's not social media. It's not paid media, which would be advertisements. It's earned media is the category. And when you're doing earned media, you've really got to think of the public service that the product or service you're promoting is doing. There's got to be a public good. And sometimes it's, a drug, a pharmaceutical, making people's lives easier and better. Sometimes it's financial insights that are going to help people build wealth. Sometimes it's an event where people might get access to things that normally would cost a lot of money, or there'd be, free giveaways or whatever. You find that public good and promote that. And, that's personally, that always gave me a good feeling trying to bring help and relief and solutions to the public. And so, yeah, it makes the job easier. It was very, it was very rare, Colin, that I had to, at least nothing's coming to mind, I had a client that was just dastardly and evil. And that I suppose if there was something like that, we didn't take the business.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. So there's no question about faking it till you make it. You find a path that allows you to message in a way that would be appropriate for the client.
That's right. And another way of saying that is acting your way into right thinking versus thinking your way into right acting. But I like what you said about acting as if. That's true too.
Your choice of degree, was that something that was there sort of family input on that? Was that something you wanted to do yourself? You'd thought about doing that during high school? How did you arrive at the choice that you made?
When I was younger, I didn't have a great deal of direction. Today I live as an out gay man, married to my husband. And even though growing up in the 80s, I thought it was a very modern time compared to the 1950s or something like that. Compared to the times we're in now, 2026, I guess acceptance was not fully there. And so because I lived in the closet, I wasn't really thinking about my future all that much. I was dealing with a lot of pain and focusing on more short-term solutions. Initially, I was a public relations major, and I went to school in the American South. I went to Emory University. And in the beginning of our senior year, when my friends were taking their graduate school entrance exams, and I really understood that the kind of, even though I made good grades and, was very engaged with my academics, I just never really thought about what came next and that lifestyle would end. And when it became clear that it would, I needed to take some time off from my academics, from my professional pursuits, and deal with coming out. And that took me about a year, working with professionals and therapists and things like that. And I knew that I enjoyed performing and I had done acting, and that was my first choice. I'm fortunate enough that my parents paid for my education. I have a lot of gratitude around that. I don't have student loans. But my parents and I had to make a compromise, and they weren't willing to support performing, acting. But film and television production, Steven Spielberg makes a pretty good salary. So that was our compromise. And I went to NYU, having grown up in Philadelphia, and it's about a 90-minute ride by car just to the north. And I've been in New York City since that time, 1992. And I did not work in that industry. It's still, um, I have some regrets about it. I think, today being a content creator, I tell a lot of stories, and I sometimes write stand-up comedy and perform that on occasion. And most of the stories that I tell in content creation are, direct to camera like this, and they're news-based sometimes or pop culture based. I wouldn't say they're, creative fiction. I have written a couple creative works that are not published yet and, still in progress and in various stages of development. And it just, life is a funny thing. And I wound up getting hired for those video production skills into public relations. It wasn't my plan, and I didn't especially enjoy it in the beginning or for quite a while. But then in fact, about 10 years into it, almost 10 years into it, I took a lot of courses in news production, and I worked very hard making professional demo tapes, and I wound up getting hired by a different public relations agency, and things really, really clicked there. We had really cool clients, social good type things, urban planning type things, films, independent films, some LGBTQ stuff. But belatedly, just as I was moving into that cooler agency, something hit from all the outreach I did to try and break into film. And I got an offer from the ABC television network in Beaumont, Texas. Very, very small market, to be a weekend anchor and a weeknight producer. It's was my dream, and it was something that I killed for. But the timing was wrong. It came at the wrong time. And I had kind of doubled down and recommitted to my PR lifestyle. So who knows, in a parallel timeline, maybe I'm Anderson Cooper, but just because you can do something doesn't mean you have to do that. And, I've had other crossroads like that came to me. I had the opportunity around the time of the global economic collapse, 2008, to move overseas to Tel Aviv, Israel, and co-launch a nonprofit organization, the only one in the world expressly dedicated to helping LGBTQ refugees make asylum from countries that were persecuting them for their sexuality or sexual identity into Western democracies. And it was a wonderful adventure. I stayed in that country for 5 years. I wasn't at that nonprofit the whole 5 years. But it does survive me today, and it's multi-million-dollar operating budget is still helping those people. And then I had another crossroads like that where after being independent in public relations and social media and content creation for a few years, I was on my way for a second interview and one with HR. I had already talked to the hiring manager. This was to be a deputy social media manager for a company that does a B2B company that does all the billing software for major corporations. And I was getting off the bus. It was in a city outside Tel Aviv, and someone called me to subcontract me for public relations for a Philadelphia-based marketing company that their business model was to make frequent trips to Israel and be a one-stop shop to help companies do their media relations and their investor relations, and companies that were already successful in Israel, but treating Israel as one big test market or beta market to enter the US. And this person said, "Oh, did I catch you at a bad time?" And I remember answering, "You caught me just in time." And then I said, "Well, listen, I'm heading to this interview, and then I'm traveling back to the States for a vacation. I'll be in Philadelphia." And then they said, "That's actually where this company is based." And it came together very quickly. And had that call not come through, I probably would be working in Tel Aviv, and that job probably would have come with some elements socially that I had been missing. Friends that were not immigrants like me, friends that were, much more native in Israel and had done the army and had families there. And, I was kind of a lone soldier, or even though I never served in military, I didn't have family in the country. And even though I studied Hebrew the whole time in adult immigrant language school, I wasn't using it. And I'm sure had that call not come through, it would have changed my life. But again, this is what parallel timelines are. And the emoji where the guy is like doing this, the thinking emoji. And the actual timeline that I'm living has been great.
Did your time in Tel Aviv, did that coincide with the technology boom in Israel?
Yes, I believe the book Startup Nation was already written by the time that I was there, but I know that I was there between 2009 and 2014, and already Israel was the third most represented country on, I think, the NASDAQ in the US already. And yes, I worked for several incubators, and I forget the other term, accelerators. And it was very much that when one they were in different stages of development. And when one group and one team said to the other, who did you guys were ready to write our messaging? And, who did you? And they said, we use this guy, Scott Piro. And I got a lot of introductions and referrals that way. And that was a great time.
So you've already touched on the language. You did make an effort to learn Hebrew, but I'm assuming that working principally in English didn't hold you back when you were there.
No, it's the Latin of the internet, or English is very essential in Israeli society and business. And a lot of my friends were other immigrants, but I had a lot of friends from the dog park. I'm a dog lover, and so some of my friends were Israeli born. And I studied all 5 years, and I still have decent Hebrew today, but probably like elementary, fourth grade level. I can travel with it. I can get out of an emergency with it. I can even express ideas clumsily. I can express myself in that language, but I did not have the discipline to restrict myself because I am a natural born communicator and my mother tongue is English, and that's just easier for me. And I can say more and grander ideas without limitations. So that's what I chose.
Something I always struggled with a little bit. I also speak another language, but I'm not as witty in my second language as I am in my mother tongue. I don't know. Did you ever find that frustrating? That inability to be quite as expressive or quite as nuanced in the
Yes.
second language?
And sometimes if we were, all out socializing and I just didn't have the level to keep up with a sophisticated conversation. And so, you kind of stare like an idiot, and you don't really want the conversation to switch into English just for you and get any kind of sort of, special treatment that also is off. So, it was all part of the experience. Um, and, but it was okay, and I think it's very good for many reasons to try and learn another language. And it's definitely easier for young people, but we're all as young as we'll ever be. And I think it's never too late to start and creating new neural pathways and so forth. I think it's good for one's neurological health. And so I'm all for it. I do still practice my Hebrew occasionally. And that's, the mobile application or platform Duolingo is terrific.
On this podcast, the theme of culture comes up a lot. But when we talk about culture, it's frequently to do with workplace culture, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I wonder for you, how much of a culture clash was there between going from working environments in the United States to working environments in Israel?
The time and the time zones were difficult. When I did, audience facing media relations, and especially the first year when I was in an immersive Hebrew class, I would be in school from 8 a.m. locally to 2 p.m., go home, nap, walk the dog, and then work from 4 p.m. local time to 11 at night. Because Israel being 7 hours ahead of New York, that 4 was, you know, 9 in the morning. And that was rough. And even after I was no longer taking that immersive class, it was, I would have the mornings for the gym time and things like this. And then my workday was afternoon through evening. My final role, the last 2 years I was there, was managing a team that was based in Philadelphia. So in that case, not a lot of different. I was dealing with Americans. I never, that the experience at the B2B billing software company would have changed everything for me, but I didn't have that experience as it went. So I never, a lot of times my only experience with, professionally, the business Israeli culture was through my clients. But even then, we were all working in English and our target audience was American press or investors. And so I was paid mostly in dollars a lot of time. Well, no, not when I was freelance. When I was freelance, I was paid in shekels locally. But I would say it was much of my professional experience had an American vibe to it.
So you were kind of like an outsider insider or vice versa.
Yes, the whole time. And even though it was early days for streaming, you know, still a lot of the American programs I liked were available on YouTube. A lot of the music that I liked, Spotify was just getting off the ground, but iTunes was prevalent and I could still access the American iTunes store. I very rarely watched Israeli television. And I think this is ultimately why I did not remain in Israel. I love that country. I love being Israeli as part of my identity, but I also deeply love the United States. And I'm very strongly identifying American also. And I never fully became Israeli that way. I never separated from my American culture, and I missed it ultimately. And I'm back in New York now for twice the amount of time since I lived in Israel. I was in Israel for a little more than 5 years, and I'm back in New York for 12.
And so you ended your time in Israel and back to the States you went.
Back to the States I went. The Philadelphia-based marketing company where I was working offered me the opportunity to open a New York office, and I did that. But ultimately, we separated, and I went back to the last media relations company right immediately prior to before I moved abroad to Israel. So I went back to the agency I was working in the early 2000s, and that was a great experience. And then I stayed with them for, 2, 3 more years. And then there was the opportunity I was ready to leave media relations. It's a lot of hustling. It's a lot of, you can get your client in the New York Times on Monday, and then by Wednesday, it's like, what have you done for me lately?
The media landscape must have already been changing. This idea of print media being as important as central as it was when we were children, to have full page adverts in newspapers and to make sure that you get the press out in a physical newspaper at that point, it was already in fairly terminal decline. Traditional media, print media, television, with the rise of YouTube, you've already mentioned streaming. How much of the nature of the job that you were doing in terms of media relations changed between, let's say, the early 2000s or the late 90s and later on when you got back?
You're so right, and you've actually nailed the timing also. I moved back in 2014. I would say as early as like 2012, I was starting to communicate with journalists in their direct messages in platforms like Instagram. Now, I wouldn't tweet them public pitches because, those are public, but I would get their attention in a public tweet and be like, redirect them back to the email channel that I had sent them, but then direct messages also. But what really happened, it wasn't so much that the clients no longer cared as much about getting in the print edition of the New York Times and were more unhappy that if they were, on the homepage, and that flipped. That's true. But the more impact I perceived was in the disappearance of local media and the swallowing up and the consolidation, so that it stopped being like you could call a main switchboard and ask to get a journalist's phone number because they were going into the office. Everybody was working as contractors now, or freelancers, or, not everybody, but many writers were. And so you might have even had their cell phone number, but was it too intrusive to use it? It's sort of like, not everybody pitched by telephone call or voicemail. I was really strong in that methodology, or that forum. I mean, had many journalists return my calls and say, "Wow, that voicemail," whereas some people would be like, "It's a waste of time. Nobody's going to listen to that." Other PR professionals. I was very strong there. I was also very strong at, writing a good pitch that gets right to the hook and right to the value above the scroll, so to speak. But definitely a bygone art of telephone pitching and voicemail pitching. And when people started to work as contractors and no longer in an office, like, it was a little bit, sometimes people were using their personal cell phones also for work. And so, first of all, there are big platforms where you could search for their phone numbers in the old days. That kind of went away. You didn't always even have the option to call their mobile. But even when you did, you had to think, am I going to be that guy who calls their mobile? So, and just the local media also just disappeared. So you'd have something like USA Today buying up and owning a lot of these smaller papers in other markets. And so if you were going to get something in a local paper in an Indianapolis or Des Moines or, you know, I don't know, even a Dallas or whatever, suddenly you couldn't, there were, those newsrooms were all cut. You couldn't dial those people in Dallas, Indianapolis, or, wherever. There was only one person in Washington. And with what they published in the main edition would go out syndicated to all those places. So it was both the way you could pitch them. Everything relied much more heavily on email than initially. And then there were just fewer gatekeepers. And when you hit, the benefits were multiplied. You could put something in a report for a client and then have an indent, USA Today, but then indent and all these other markets and links, and all those circulation, you could tally them up and have, but you needed to hit with that one gatekeeper first. And that just got harder and harder. So, you would switch to blogs. I'm sure these days it's also podcasts a lot more. But I moved at that point around 2017 and stayed in external communications, but no longer media relations. Instead, I was involved with the CMS and the web mastering of it and making sure that, blog content or content like about us, our team, how we work. Actually, I had been doing that kind of work almost a decade already, writing that type of content, but doing it in-house now for a nonprofit organization, also managing their socials and like the MailChimp, the subscriber list. And sometimes there was, media relations aspects like crafting a statement, but responsive media relations when the outlets were calling you to talk to the figurehead or the founder or the executive director of the organization. And so, yeah, it was a wonderful career. Like I said, I was slow to take to it, or not initially, but then when I, found my peeps there at the right type of organizations, I learned so many lessons about how to tell stories quickly, how to take care of relationships, which is transferable so many different ways, not only as I found out later in my own career, directing all that internally, managing an intranet for the company, or the CEO's message going to the staff, internally within a company. All those, the same skill set from external really applied, but also just the, like how to manage, I guess it's a form of project management, and never the mentality of keeping something always in my court. Even if I'm, hey, I've gotten you this, and well, let's go back to media relations again. But I give, a media kit and some press materials, and the journalist says, this is very interesting. I could see myself writing this. I'm working on another story. Let me get back to you by the 13th. So I would put something in my calendar for right around then so that if I didn't hear from them, I could reach out. But even more than that, I would say, and listen, because I know how busy you are, would it be all right if I checked in with you around that time? You know, a poor public relations professional just knocks on the front door once. And if they don't get a response, they say, I tried. You know, a better public relations professional, if they don't get a response on the front door, they go around back. I mean, this is, metaphor, of course, but I was even like, flying in on a chopper and crying down the rungs and trying to get in the chimney. Not obtrusively so, but just, there's a fine line, and you understand when there is not interest, but sometimes there is, and people just need to be redirected back to your story. And so, yeah.
You've worn a lot of hats, it seems, in different roles across the decades. At any stage, did you feel out of your depth or unprepared? And if you did, how did you deal with that?
That's a great question. I also think that AI is helpful in processing thoughts like that. What I mean is, I recently had meetings with people about joining and becoming head of communications for their facility. And the job description talked about an annual communications plan in-house. Now, I had not done that before, but I had done all the components of it. I had done campaigns. I had done, social. I had drafted press releases. I had done all the elements that go into an annual campaign. I just did them more in short campaigns, like for a book launch release cycle, or I did them internally, when I was doing internal communications for that multinational tech company, in internal comms. I hadn't really done, and I had done editorial calendars in that role also, but I hadn't done it that way. So I was just transparent about that. I also was in discussions somewhere else, a think tank, to be their head of communications. And that was a new role that wasn't being backfilled. And it was a similar mindset. I had done all that type of strategy, and I had done it with clients. I had done it with the CEO for that internal capacity, but I had done it managing a team and managing a team of interns and, mentoring their experience. So I had managed others, but I had not been the head of communications for a think tank. So a lot of it is realizing that you may not have done the job role or the title yet, but you can still succeed because you have done all the building blocks of the title. Now, maybe that won't be true in every situation, but I had two experiences recently where it was true, and I was very, very confident about the way I talked about that and not hiding that, and that I hadn't had that exact title or done that exact role before. And so I think not creative framing, but, and that's why I say AI is helpful. A lot of times you do actually have the experience, even you just sometimes might need help understanding that you have that experience already. Skills are transferable.
You mentioned in your answer just now that you provided mentorship. Have you been given mentorship at any point throughout your long career?
Yes. When I worked at the small boutique PR agency, I had already been in the field for 10 years. I knew how to use the databases. I was great at phone pitching, but I didn't really write press releases yet. I was doing a lot of work with morning drive radio tours. So contacting a terrestrial radio morning show producers who would show up for their work locally at 5, produce a show from 6 to 10, and then stay maybe an hour tops preparing their show for the following day and then leaving. Weird hours. And you follow the sunrise. And so you would pitch these people from 10 to 11 on the East Coast, 11 to 12 Central, and so forth. And then, California, from 1 to 2 p.m. in the afternoon, Eastern time. But I would take existing press materials and put them together in something called a one sheet, because those producers, by the time they were responding to my pitches, they had already woken up at a crazy hour and produced a show for 4 or 5 hours. They weren't reading through lots of content. I guess it's before we had the expression of TLDR, but it was like that. Too long, didn't read. So I was giving them something called a one sheet, but it was all distilled content from existing press materials. It was only 10 years into my career that I was mentored by someone learning how to write a press release and learning about headline lead agreement, how whatever your headline is needs to match the first two sentences of your first paragraph. And then, how to incorporate one or two pull quotes, how those quotes work. Blah, 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 said so and so, blah, 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 blah. So you can have a long quote, but you break it up with the attribution in the middle. There's no press release that wasn't improved by having bullet points in it, like these types of things. I only learned that 10 years into my career. And I also learned a great deal about how to behave in meetings with clients. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth. I love to engage a client, share my opinions with the client about their product or service. Even better is really letting the client talk first and and being more in the background a little bit. I learned all these things from a mentor 10 years into my career. And then later on in Israel, at that last opportunity, the Philadelphia-based marketing company, I learned again about, the marketing funnel. I had never really been in the marketing side of things, and I got certified in, HubSpot, courses and things like this. And then later when I transferred to the Jewish American nonprofit space, I learned and one organization was legal based. And so kind of like a law firm, I learned all about that industry. And it's great to incorporate new frameworks, new norms and protocols. And, mentorship is a beautiful thing in both directions, in my opinion.
How important is it to like or even to love what you do as a job?
It's very useful. It has a lot of dividends and benefits. Earlier in my career, I didn't feel that way. I had wanted to be a performer, and I continued being a performer for a little bit. I was in season 1, episode 4 of Sex and the City. If you press pause at the exact right moment, you'll see me. I was an extra in a film with Kevin Costner called For the Love of the Game. I was an extra in a film with Bruce Willis called The Siege. I was in some independent films. And it was disappointing. I felt early in my career that something had gone wrong and this wasn't where I was supposed to be. It was long and slow and sometimes painful. It reminds me of an expression that goes, everything will be all right in the end. And if it's not all right, well, it means it's not the end. And it was just a long, slow process. And, about 5 years into that career, I tried to change careers and pivot into news production. I was successful, but the timing didn't work out. I had moved to another public relations agency, and so that was this one crossroad I didn't take. The other agency was so much cooler. I got that mentor and all those things where I felt that this is wrong. I'm not supposed to be doing this. Suddenly, when you're on a red carpet meeting television and movie stars and you've got the cool Madonna headset on and, okay, we're sending you, so-and-so and, kind of fun, and you get this, the PR swag bags and the goodie bags and access to things like that, and then when you start to work when you launch a nonprofit organization that helps refugees that are persecuted for being, just being who they are. And I'm born that way, also born gay, but fortunately in a freedom respecting country like the United States, I got to indirectly, albeit, help those people and get satisfaction and meaning from that. And then continuing in other nonprofit organizations. And I get to, I got to do that by working in Jewish American communal organizations. And so it reminds me of another expression, don't quit before the miracle. And, I used to think that, sometimes you hear do what you love. And I wasn't doing what I loved earlier in my career. But I felt maybe trapped. And once I started to make a certain salary, it felt harder and harder to pivot. And I thought I was going to be the type of person who, all right, so I clock in 9 to 5 and I'll get my meaning after work. And, I've run marathons. I sang in a gay choir. I got a dog, but I'm not finished working. I'm in my mid-50s. I'll probably work at least another 10 years. And I no longer have that experience of, oh my God, I hate what I do and I hate working. And, I approach everything from a service point of view. Who can I help today? How can I be the maximum service to the public, to my clients, to my employer, to my community? And I also try and cultivate as much gratitude as I can. And some of these shortcomings of feeling restless or dissatisfied, they are really smoothed out when you put your concentration and focus on gratitude, in my experience.
Scott Piro, it's been a delight talking to you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Colin, you're so welcome. Thank you for having me on the show. I hope I said something of value to your listeners and viewers.